Hey, guys. Welcome to Building This Community.
This is your city business and policy development podcast. We're your hosts,
Luke Patrick
and Andrew Klump. Welcome to this week's episode of Building This Community. Our guest today is Gill Holland, who is known for being in the entertainment industry in Louisville and also for his work developing Nulu. Gill, how are you?
Doing good. Happy Monday. Happy December 2020. Hopefully the last one of the last months of this terrible time.
Yeah, seriously.
Happy Monday to you as well. So let's dive right in here. You're a movie and music producer as well as a self-described community builder, and obviously you're known for your instrumental work in developing the Nulu neighborhood in Louisville. But with that said, can you give us a little bit more about your background?
Sure. So I'm from a small town in North Carolina, Davidson. There's a little college there, but it's actually the Portland neighborhood, and even East Market Street reminds me a little bit of the Davidson main strip, 1- and 2-story buildings with active retail and some offices and nice pedestrian neighborhood, and everybody kind of knows everybody and looks out for everybody. I was one of those people who didn't know what they want to do with their life for a long time. So I went to law school, figured that was a good holding pattern. Then went and worked in Paris, France. I'd done a junior year in Montpellier, incidentally, the sister city of Louisville. And then while I was there, I worked in a law firm and was pretty bored. But one of the clients was a French film producer, obviously French because we were in Paris. And I had seen like as many movies as this gentleman had. And I was like, oh my gosh, I love movies. People work in movies. I'd never, growing up in a small town, it's like lawyer, doctor, banker, teacher, policeman, I just never even thought about the fact that somebody could work in the entertainment business. I'd always been a consumer, love movies. So I was like, man, I want to work in movies. So I gave up the law at age 29 and ended up in New York City and started interning for some film companies. And one thing led to another. And, people started telling me I should be a producer. And I was like, what is that? It's like, I met one once and they're like, well, everybody, you get stuff done. You're not a liar. Friendly, extroverted, seem like you have good ideas. Yeah, you'd be a good producer. So anyway, I made a little business card when you could go to Times Square and pay $5 and get 50 business cards from a little machine. And then next thing I knew, I was a producer. I always tell when I talk to school students and at university, whatnot, I always tell all of them, like, everybody could be a producer. Just call yourself a producer. You go to Hollywood, everybody says they're a producer. So then there's a difference between producers who actually make stuff and some who are always just looking for their project. But anyway, so I met a lot of people in New York, distributed short films first, which is a great kind of calling card for people who want to make features. And then the first feature that I produced was called Hurricane Streets, and we got really lucky. And we were the first film ever to win 3 prizes at the Sundance Film Festival. And we sold for $1.8 million to MGM, and we shot the film for like $250K with friends in the East Village of Manhattan. So it was a big, and my life's been downhill ever since then in the entertainment world. But anyway, that led to a lot of stuff. So 100 and something movies later, and then I started the record label, the music company, basically because it's really hard clearing music for movies. And, music's the last most important creative thing you put into a movie. And in independent film, you've always run out of money by the time you're trying to source music. And I was going out every night in New York anyway. And so I was seeing, Norah Jones, who was playing every Sunday in front of like 6 people at the living room. So I knew a lot of musicians. And then one day I was like, I should just start my own music company because I can help get exposure for these acts and I can also get free music for my movies. So that was kind of a win-win. Mm-hmm. So that's the short story.
Well, no, that honestly sounds like a whirlwind. I'm sure it was tough to keep up once it started going. How did you make that transition from the entertainment world into the development world?
Right. So when you live in New York and Paris and Barcelona and London, I mean, I'd never owned a house. I'd rarely owned a car. And, when I started coming back and forth to Louisville, first of all, I was like, man, everybody lives in a house. Like, people are rich in this town. They all own houses. And this is, amazing. I didn't know anybody who owned their own apartment in one person. I knew one person who owned their own apartment in New York. And my wife actually, who had gotten her master's in urban planning at Columbia, and we met basically in New York. She had always wanted to kind of start a public market. One of our first dates, we actually went to Seattle to Pike Place to see the big public market there. And when we were expecting our first child, I was like, I was just working at our house on Cherokee Road. And then I was like, man, I got to get an apartment. And then one thing led to another. And she'd actually looked at buying at one point the building where Angel's Envy is now. It was quite a contaminated site. And then we got married and moved back. And then, I saw the building, which is now the Green Building. And I was like, that looks like a beautiful place for something good to happen. And, it was all boarded up, as were many of the buildings there on East Market Street.
No, absolutely. And honestly, we'll get to the Green Building. It's an impressive turnaround you've done. But I guess one question I have whenever I'm thinking about the work you've done, what kind of factors impact your decision to engage in a specific development project, like tax credits or, the potential for appreciation or just your simple desire to impact a neighborhood?
Yeah, well, so, with movies and music and buildings and neighborhoods and towns, for me, I've basically got to fall in love, because it has never been about, there are a couple movies I worked on because I needed a paycheck, but generally anything that as a producer I was, taking from start to finish, you got to love that project. And a lot of times you look at Hollywood films, you'll look at a film that has a name screenwriter, a famous director, a famous actor. Everything looks great on paper, and the movie just is not good. And that I could talk about why there's so many bad movies. That's another conversation. But the one or two times I tried to do a movie that I was like, oh, we're going to make money on this movie, invariably they just bombed. And then the movies or the bands that I just was like, I just love this band. I have no idea if they're going to ever make a penny. Every now and then they would do well because they struck a chord. If they strike a chord with you, they'll strike a chord with the universe. So for me, buildings, neighborhoods, towns, I fell in love with Louisville. I then fell in love with the stretch of East Market Street. It was a very diverse urban environment, which coming from, basically I lived a block from the Bowery on St. Mark's Place. Felt very cozy. It's never been about, and it still is not about like the pure numbers. Obviously, I have investors. We try to show a positive return, but we're really more about impact. So, that's why I say, I'm more about community building, whether it's around an intellectual property like a musician's work or a movie, or real property like, bricks and mortar, a building. So I like helping develop things, taking things from a vision, an idea to a better version of themselves.
So would you say that your philosophy then, or what is your philosophy then when you actually get into it, rather than just deciding to target a specific area? What is kind of your philosophy once you start working within a particular project?
Yeah. So again, a lot of times, how they say, sometimes the image in a piece of wood just speaks to the sculptor, and the sculptor just releases the image that was there in that block of granite or block of wood. Mm-hmm. And so sometimes I just feel like there's a calling, something was meant to be. And then when I say, I do want to work on this, then it's all about building the team. So if it's a movie, who are all the people that are way smarter than me that know how to do the various things on a movie set that I don't know how to do, i.e. shoot a camera, hold a boom mic, figure out the wardrobe, figure out continuity, figure out how to edit it, figure out sound design. I know nothing of any of those areas, and they're all super important. And then when you're doing a building, it's the exact same thing. Actually, halfway through the Green Building project, I realized oh my gosh, I'm just producing the Green Building movie, but it's a bricks and mortar building as opposed to a intellectual property of a script. There's the same challenges with some crew members, and it's a day-to-day. You're knocking it out day to day, and then a year later you have a finished product. And a movie, you're trying to shoot 3 pages a day if it's a 100-page script, and building's kind of the same way. So it's really building the team. If it's the neighborhood, a bigger project like a neighborhood like Nulu or Portland, the first thing you do is just join the neighborhood groups and show up all the time, because you need to know as much as you can about the area, about the history, about the culture, about what people want. And then you figure out if there's a value add that you can bring. And a lot of times you're just working to enhance the existing assets that maybe just haven't been fully, come to fruition yet.
Well, that kind of plays into the next thing I wanted to bring up. Amid everything that's happened in Louisville lately, gentrification has become an even hotter topic. And how do you explain your balance with community building versus gentrification? I know there's criticism whenever somebody tries to revitalize an older, more historic neighborhood like a Portland or something like that. And what's your response?
Yeah, we think about gentrification all the time. I've traveled extensively, and so I've seen what's happened in Austin and San Francisco, and there are cities that have tons of high-paying tech jobs and are experiencing explosive growth. And Louisville, we have lots of Amazon fulfillment center jobs, and in the last 5 years, we've grown less than 1%. That's total, not yearly. And then the last 20 years, we've grown on average 0.67%, so 2/3 of 1% on average yearly over the last 20 years. So, for example, in the Portland neighborhood, there's 1,400. When we started 7.5 years ago, there's 1,400 vacant abandoned properties out of the 5,500 total. So 1,400 vacant abandoned properties, if we can get one family a week to move to Portland, which sounds like a lot of people, it still takes 26 years just to get to the density that we had in 1936 before the Great Flood of 37. Mm-hmm. So if you look at how Louisville's developed, if you look at Prospect and St. Matthews and PRP, all those kind of neighborhoods really developed with people from West Louisville leaving that part of town because the river drops 22 feet right there, and West Louisville was underwater the longest and the deepest in the flood of 37, and then the second highest flood was 1945, which a lot of people forget about. So, and then you throw in, redlining, you throw in the highway system getting built, and you throw in the flood wall getting built. So all those things displaced, chunks of people, and the highway systems specifically really kind of cut the city in half and cut Portland from its maritime cultural heritage, if you will. So, we are very proud of the revitalization that we do, and we target vacant abandoned properties. And we, turn them into either affordable houses if they're shotguns, or actively occupied nonprofits or businesses that we feel will be a value add to the community and work with the community. That makes. And then the other thing too is just the word gentrification is such a loaded word, and for some people it means one thing, other people it means another thing. I mean, you'll talk to an African-American friend who says gentrification is racial banishment. And then I'll talk to, this summer I talked to this, Prospect Caucasian millionaire who's like, man, we need some more gentrification in West Louisville. It just looks like Beirut over there. Oh, and I'm like, you do realize that term is really like loaded and for some really offensive. Like literally they had no idea that term has meanings. So there's a lot of education on both sides, but the reality is there's 8,000 vacant abandoned properties west of 9th Street. So if you do one family a week there, that's 98 years to get to the 1936 density. So we need, I don't think anybody thinks that we don't want to invest in these neighborhoods. That being said, there's government programs that could be implemented. There could be moratoriums on property tax increases. There could be tax incentives for historically Black neighborhoods, historic any historic neighborhoods. I mean, we have a 5-year property tax moratorium increase on historic properties if you fix up a historic property in Louisville. But that goes away after 5 years. And, we could have rent control. I mean, I lived in a rent controlled apartment in New York when I was a, starving entrepreneur. So I've seen the benefits of affordable housing, pro-tenant policies. So rent stabilization, rent control, we could have all those things. I mean, Kentucky is what's called a property rights state. And, I think they're going to be hard to get through in Frankfurt because a lot of the rural legislators don't really understand some of these urban challenges. Mm-hmm. Even though I do think there's some parallels between like Portland and West Louisville and some Appalachian communities, maybe one reason Charles Booker did so well in his primary.
Fair enough. So going back a little bit, seeing that you've been to so many and lived and experienced in so many different cities, are there any tactics you've seen from other places that you're trying to implement here in your development process?
My main thing is like local business and family owned business. And so if you look at Nulu, there are no national chains. If you look at Portland, except for this little strip there at 22nd where there's a Dairy Queen and McDonald's and a Subway, it's all about locally owned businesses, family owned businesses. I have learned just from lots of places that's what makes a town cool, right? Strip malls with national chains, you can just plop down and you're in anywhere USA. Nobody's going to, leave Louisville and be like, hey, I was on Shelbyville Road, man. I love that I love that town. So locally owned businesses, working with a lot of nonprofits, because, there's so many. Louisville's a town, towns of our size are supposed to support like 900 nonprofits, and we have like 2,400 nonprofits. Lots doing great work all over the community, but really, we've gotten dozens and dozens to move an office in the Portland neighborhood. And the Larry Stess, who's the preacher who runs the table, the Pay What You Can restaurant, he calls it, he wanted to do intentional living. So he moved to the Portland neighborhood in the 90s because he was, doing outreach and ministry in the area. He's like, well, why don't I live here? So we've gotten a lot of nonprofits like, why aren't you officing in the places that you're trying to serve? Just having and that's why, I moved there 7.5 years ago. In terms of the cities, obviously, like you can look at, Paris, which has boulevards, tree-lined boulevards. And I think about, wow, Jefferson Street here in Louisville, if we had trees, as many trees as they had on the Champs-Élysées, Jefferson Street would be a beautiful boulevard. And then if we had a streetcar going from the new track and field facility all the way down to the end of Nulu, kind of gateway up to the Highlands, then all of a sudden we're a much more connected town. We have bus routes that are always liable to be moved. But if you have fixed track investment, it's much more helpful for entrepreneurial activity, because then people know that the rails are not going to get pulled up and moved. And you would see a flourishing of businesses along the Jefferson Street Railway, light rail or whatever it is. And then you look at a town like, Copenhagen, where it is a sea of bicycles. There are bicycles everywhere. And there's like old cobblestone roads, and everybody's on bikes. So inherently green, inherently healthier. We're a car-centric town, and it kills me. And then you look at Oslo, and that's my mom's hometown, so I speak Norwegian and spend a lot of time in Oslo. They've now banned private cars from the city center. And, I wrote an article 13 years ago in the Courier saying, well, what if we banned cars from 1st to 8th and Main to Broadway in downtown Louisville? And then you could take all the kind of Paris cafes, could all spill out onto the sidewalks. We leave one lane for, delivery vehicles or whatever. And then all of downtown becomes, a cross between East Market Street and what 4th Street Live could be if it was more locally focused. So those are, some of the things.
So you're actually hitting on, well, we already did an episode on tree policy and how important that is. And street design and other things that we're actually going to be getting to in future episodes. But how important to you is street design to business growth?
Well, so, if you look at, let's call it East Downtown. So when I got to Louisville 14 years ago, 2005, there was, very little activity on kind of East Main, East Market, and East Jefferson. But East Market, there was life, there was, Billy Hertz and people in the 90s. And then you go back to the 70s, people like Cleve Gatchell and Barbara Smith. So a lot of people had been working to kind of keep Market Street alive since the late 1800s, when it was a primarily German immigrant, but Market Street, right? And then you start thinking about it and like, well, why is Market Street the one? And then you realize there's that one counterflow lane. So it's actually a two-way street, even though there's 30,000 plus cars a day leaving downtown, screaming through what is now Nulu. I mean, I used to say, if we could just get, 10% of these cars to stop every day, this neighborhood's going to be super vibrant. Mm-hmm. But East Market Street was literally like the 4-lane highway getting out of town to go up to your nicer area of, the Highlands or Frankfurt Ave or Prospect, whatever. But there's that one counterflow lane, and the neighborhood fought for that. And sure enough, that is, I would say, why East Market Street has really, really blossomed quicker. I mean, Main and Jefferson are coming, but so I think that just speaks to two-way streets. And then, all those side streets are one-way, Shelby and Clay, and they're slowly converting to two-way, but I don't understand why it takes so long to, converting a street to two-way is not an expensive endeavor. And you can read study after study after study showing that it's better for neighborhood development.
Well, and that's another topic that we have for another day. But, just from my experience, I've been working with the Prosper Preston group here to revitalize, redevelop Preston Highway. And in that experience, we've learned how much the state, at least in Kentucky, owns most of the control over a large portion of the streets in Louisville.
Yeah, East Market Street is a state road.
Yeah, and it goes through the heart of downtown. And it's unbelievable that you have to go to the state and fight tooth and nail to get any type of redesign in this city.
Yeah, well, we spent years working on a, Nulu streetscape, a 10-block, $13 million project with partners with MSD. It got approved like 3 times, and it still hasn't been implemented. And at this point, I'm pretty sure it's never going to be implemented because, the good folks in Frankfurt they've approved, I don't know, $4 billion worth of road projects, and there's only $400 million worth of money sitting there for them. So then even a place where like we spent in the whole Nulu area, there's $500 million of private sector investment in the, I don't know, in and around that area, and they still can't get their act together to do what they all voted to get done, which was the streetscape improvement. At this point, we might, it might be too late. So I'm not saying it needs to be done. It's just there was a lot of time, 10, 9, 11 years ago spent on that, and the vision was good.
Mm-hmm. So beyond just streetscapes, then, do you have any other just ideas, you kind of hinted at it earlier, that you think that Metro Louisville, like that city governments can do to aid in development?
I mean, I would love to have, things like, expedited permitting for green buildings. Any taxpayer funded or subsidized building, which would include like, nonprofits that get the, tax write-offs for folks and religious institutions. Any of that kind of construction, they should be green, right? Even now in Kentucky, where we have 4.5 solar hours per day, people are starting to realize like, oh, this makes sense, renewable energy and sustainability. We got to kind of move quicker out of this, being a coal state. And, while we appreciate the heritage of Appalachia, it's time to embrace the innovation and realities of the 21st century. And plus we have all this water, there's hydrologic possibilities. Bioswales, Louisville specifically has a combined sewer overflow system issue. And, we're under that, almost $1 billion EPA consent decree. And, if we could have bioswales on street corners, MSD did a good job on 17th and Market. There's some really nice bioswales right there. And, if we could incent, and they have an incentive for green roofs, keep that up. And so we capture all the stormwater runoff before it hits the pavement and then washes into the Ohio or, leaves our hydrologic system. So all these things, I think, more incentives to take existing, historic buildings and fix them up. I mean, the benefit for Louisville is that the citizens, we own the water company and we own MSD, right? So lots of cities have privatized those industries, but we own them. And so, there's 8,000 vacant abandoned properties west of 9th Street, but we've already spent tens of millions of dollars of taxpayer money providing services to empty lots and vacant buildings. Vacant buildings are where lots of bad stuff happens. And you could talk to any cop. The last thing they want to do is answer a call at a vacant building because you don't know what's going to be in there. Not to mention depressing the neighborhood kid who wonders why the world doesn't care about him or her. So we should incentivize people to fix up these vacant abandoned properties because we're then providing consumers for our citizen-owned utilities. So there's like a triple win there. Instead, I feel like we just keep getting more and more greenfield development, building the suburbs, building out towards the county line, and that's inherently not sustainable.
No, I couldn't agree more. But turning a little bit back to Nulu and everything you've done there, for those that don't know, and I hope I'm getting this right, the Green Building was the first commercial building in Louisville to get the platinum certification from LEED, as the Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design certification. Can you tell us what that meant for you and how important it is for you to incorporate environmentally sustainable approaches into the projects that you're involved with?
Right. So the Green Building opened in 2008. And as far as I know, and this is a terrible statistic, it's still the only commercial LEED Platinum building in the state of Kentucky, as far as I know. Now, the Bernheim Visitor Center, that's a great nonprofit. That's the LEED Platinum building. Those are the only two I know of. There's got to be another one somewhere. But at the time when we announced in 2006 we were going to build, renovate this 110-year-old building on East Market, people just thought we were out of our minds. And plus, building a green building in the state of Kentucky, a coal state, it's just inherently kind of a revolutionary act. And me, I'm an independent film producer. I work outside the studio system. And I was like, well, I kind of want to be an independent energy producer. And I really think in the future, energy will be so distributed that every single building is going to be like a mini power plant. Every car will have a charger. Every house will have solar that'll then charge the car. So the Green Building for us was, and we didn't set out to actually make it the super green. I just said things like, if you wander around Norway, in the small towns of Norway, you see lots of houses that have thatch, sod, grass roofs. Some houses will have goats up on the roof eating the grass. So, if the Vikings knew that, a green roof is good for keeping the temperature warm in the winter and cooler in the summer, why can't we use that? So I was like, let's have a green roof. I didn't realize all the benefits of stormwater runoff mitigation until I really got into it. And the whole water thing is super interesting when it comes to the sustainability and buildings. And then I definitely wanted solar panels because I wanted to produce my own energy. And since we'd never owned a building, I was like, I don't know how much a building costs to run. Like, when you buy a car, it says how many miles per gallon you're going to get. But a building, that was kind of scary. So I was like, I want to create as much energy as we can. And then we had hydrothermal wells, geothermal, sorry. And, the architect. And then I was like, I want to use all local products and, local people. And the architect was like, well, if you do all this stuff, you're going to be like LEED Platinum. And I was like, oh yeah, I went to a LEED building once. Literally, I'd only been to one, and then we were like, okay, let's go for it. So we went for it. It was a little more time intensive. I have not pursued a certification of any other green buildings. I've certainly used a lot of the same tactics. And there is a good payback. In the Portland neighborhood, I'd love to have every building we work on be green and have solar, but there's just so much deferred maintenance. Sometimes you just got to get the roof fixed as cheaply and quickly as possible to get the building then put into service. So we've kind of not done as much green stuff as I would have liked, just because the short-term need is so just imminent, and the payback on a sustainability initiative sometimes is a little more long-term. So we'll get there, but
I think you hit on it a little bit, but what do you think is holding back other developers from seeking that kind of certification, or at the very minimum, implementing more sustainable approaches in the projects that they engage in?
I mean, I do think it's coming. I mean, one of the reasons we did, in general, I think there's too much emphasis on money, right? People are just like, money drives so much of the conversation. You look at Business First articles or whatever, and it's like, how much was spent? How much was spent? And my impetus is always like, well, okay, there's a return on investment, but what's the return on community? Like, what is the impact? So how do you define success? Some people define it by the pro forma, and if you talk to lots of developers, and especially suburban developers, they can get a 12% annualized ROI, whatever. And I'm like, but what's that's just not how we define success. Like, I want to have positive impact. I want to be a positive ripple effect. We call what we do urban acupuncture. We try to take away the negative spot and end up with a positive ripple. So there's a double win. And then, if we have this good return on community, and, the first year we opened the green building, like 10,000 people came through the building. And, front page of the Courier Journal, got written up in the New York Times. And those are all ways, those are all things that I put on my kind of mental pro forma as positive returns for, our time here on Earth. So I think people are getting it. I do think, a lot of developers, it really is just more about the money. And so then it has to pencil out. And, if you want to sell your building in 3 to 5 years and the payback is, 8 years, then you don't necessarily care. Now, I will say Kentucky finally passed EPAD legislation called PACE in some places, where the sustainability initiatives you invest in your building, you can have a separate loan line item for, and it's paid through the property tax at the end of the year, so it goes with the building. So that's it's still, I mean, people don't really know about it yet. It's been around for 2 years, but it's starting to be taken advantage of more often now.
Well, that's pretty cool, though. Yeah.
Yeah, it's an amazing, great program.
Well, and we've also talked about this a little bit, but can you tell us what your plans are for the Portland neighborhood? What kind of projects you're working on over there right now?
Yeah, well, so 7.5 years ago, I said I had a 10-year plan to try to, help revitalize this super historic part of, former sister city from 1811 to Louisville, and if you go to New Orleans and then you come to Portland, for me, Portland looks a lot like New Orleans. There's all these historic shotgun houses. It's a river city, if you will. It's right next to downtown. It's got amazing history. So, started learning about the history, hired Jim Higdon. He wrote an amazing history of the Portland neighborhood and only got to the year 1900. So we need a volume 2 at some point. And, that I want to have impact, positive impact for the community I love. I always joke that I want Louisville to be so cool that my kids will want to come here after college and take care of me. And Louisville is slowly coming up the list, but I do think, most college graduates, they're still looking at the Austins and Seattles and Nashvilles and Atlanta, and we're just way cooler. We have a much better story to tell. We just don't do a very good job telling it. For lots of reasons. So, leverage the existing, the amazing people, the amazing buildings, amazing culture, amazing history, and then you got to have some new, you have to have some new money to come in because there's so much deferred maintenance and so many empty buildings that need work. I mean, I did the math just on the 8,000 vacant abandoned shotguns or houses west of 9th. Our average, the ones that we bought, and we really targeted the worst vacant abandoned properties that were being used for the most nefarious The one that we do a lot. We get the crime reports from the cops. We see the hot, corners, and we're like, oh, well, that's where a lot of the drug activity is taking place. So we bought, I think, 16 shotguns at the beginning, fixed them up. They're all, turned them all into affordable houses, $650 a month. There are several tenants with, right to buy the properties. They are now all no longer with us, these properties, but the crime rate started coming down with that. And our average cost ended up being about $80,000, $86,000, including purchase price. And then so if you do that math for all of West Louisville, that's $640 million. We could buy, fix, renovate all these historic properties. $640 million sounds like a lot. In the grand scheme of thing, I think it would pay for itself. So we need political will, social capital, investment capital, and then the redlining. Maybe it's not racial, but it's still basically there. So maybe it's not legally sanctioned racism anymore, but the redlining is still with us, and its impacts are still severe in these neighborhoods. So we got to counteract that.
Yeah, so I mean, redlining still has ramifications to this day. That's absolutely true. So, but looking at your particular project now, do you think COVID has impacted the work you're doing? And if so, how?
I mean, obviously, lots of tenants aren't paying rent, and we're totally fine with that. We have lots of local family-owned businesses that we work with, and we don't want any of them going away. So in Nulu, that's more of a challenge because Nulu's more, kind of established as a retail and, food neighborhood. Portland's still super early in its development of retail. And, 7.5 years ago, there was not one sit-down food establishment. And now there's 4. They're all obviously closed right now. But in general, being so close to downtown, being, city center, we've had less COVID impact. There's also just bigger buildings. People can be more, distanced. But I do think the COVID thing goes away by the summer, and, we're back to where we were. And I think both neighborhoods are situated for great kind of comebacks, if you will. I mean, the Small Business Saturday in Nulu, a lot of people said was one of the top 3 days they've ever.
No, absolutely. My last question here is just, do you think that there's anything that the city should be doing to incentivize growth in the West End? And maybe did they help you at all in the development of Nulu? I mean,
Nulu was really a private sector initiative. There was a vibrant group, it was the East Downtown Business Association, and then it became the East Market District Association. Bill Marzian was the president, and then I ended up being the president for like 5 years, and then that's when people voted to kind of rebrand the area as Nulu. And Rick Murphy's now the head. Part of it is the city just kind of let us do our thing. I mean, I will say they gave some facade loans. There's very limited money in city government, which is one of the reasons that I think it's so important that the private sector, the thoughtful and impact-minded, community-minded developers need to be looking at West Louisville, because there's no government money, and there's not enough nonprofits. Even if they want to do stuff, there's just not enough money. The only place there's enough money to actually turn the needle and redress these 8 decades since 1937 of disinvestment in West Louisville is from the private sector. So we did get a 5-year moratorium on property tax on the green building. Please and thank you. Got a Metco loan, I think, and we got a facade loan. So there was a couple low, 10, 15, 20 grand loans. So everything helps. And, same in Portland. I know that they have been helpful with Amelia Pillow's microbrewery. There's lots of historic buildings. So there is a community incentive for facades to be restored. And it just, makes it look prettier. And then, trees, there's so few trees in West Louisville. It's astounding when you drive down like Eastern Parkway, or you drive down, Bank Street, and just notice the difference. It's not that it's hard to plant trees, I guess, or it's hard to maintain trees. It should be something we can figure out.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, we've talked about the impact that they have. There's a noticeable temperature difference between East and West Louisville. And I think one of the main contributing factors is the lack of canopy coverage on the West End.
Yeah. We planted on Montgomery Street between 25th and 26th. We worked with Louisville Grows when we first moved to the Portland neighborhood 7.5 years ago. And we worked with Louisville Grows and we planted, 10 or so maples there on the south side of Montgomery. And they always say the best time to plant a tree is 10 years ago. And it's now almost, 7.5 years, and those trees are so beautiful. And of all the things we've worked on, like literally that's one of the things that I'm like most proud of is a block of beautiful maple trees. It's just a night and day difference of what it was to what it is.
Yeah. I mean, they can make such a tremendous difference. But I hate to do it. We really need to start winding down. Before we sign off, got a couple questions we need to get through, though. We want to give you a chance to plug any kind of projects or anything you're working on right now. Do you have anything you want to promote?
Well, so we have a movie that came called Faith, about a preacher kind of questioning his faith. That came out a couple days ago with Brian Garrity, the actor from Hurt Locker. We got another movie that's coming out in a couple months called Roommate Wanted, which is just kind of a fun horror comedy. We've got a great, Carly Johnson. We just dropped her full length. She's an amazing singer. If you don't know her, immediately check her out. We got a record from Johnny Berry and the Outliers, a local country. I think he's a superstar. I've been trying to do a deal with him for like 10 years. That's probably going to come out early January. There's a lot of activity over at La La Land. In terms of Portland, we'll be finishing, our 24-unit affordable housing that we partnered with Housing Partnership on, filled up immediately. $725 a month for 2 bedrooms, $830 for brand new 3-bedroom apartment. Neighbors all very excited about that. And then we have another mixed use 20 units going up at 17th and Bank. We'll call that Pilot House. So we're trying to, bring more maritime references kind of back to Portland. We spend a lot of time looking at the Portland history. The Portland Museum has an Audubon show that opens soon now. And then they have a pop-up tribute to Paul Horning, Portland's golden boy, who recently passed away, R.I.P. to Paul. And I'm just, support Farm to Fork and the table and these restaurants and do the takeouts and Michiotti Cafe. Support all your local business.
No, absolutely. Absolutely. And final question before we can let you go. We ask all our guests the same thing. If you had the power to change one policy in Louisville, what would it be?
If I could change one thing in Louisville, I think I would go for that, like no cars downtown and just have street cafes, plants, parklets, turn all those parking spaces into, green space, walking space, terraces for retail. I think we could create a lot of business, create a lot of social goodwill, and be a really walkable town.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you. I wish we could get something like that done. I think it would do a lot to change the face of the city. But we really appreciate you coming on. Andrew and I need to sign off, but this has been an awesome conversation. And again, we really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks, Gill.
Thank you all so much. Building this community.
We'll pick back up with our reaction segment after a word from our sponsor.
Well, Luke, that was another interesting conversation, as always. Gill brought up a whole lot of topics, including, his background in history and music and movie producing, maybe more of his experience in international cities as far as their design compared to what Louisville is doing. And there was obviously also the conversation about gentrification. So before we dive into this, I do want to just maybe almost put up like a disclaimer, but that I think what you and I are trying to do here, Luke, is provide an education on policy and make policies more accessible to people. But that education, that experience is very much a learning process for us as it is for our listeners. And so with that said, I think gentrification is a topic that will obviously take up some of our discussion here in this reaction segment, but it is something that has a racial component to it. It's difficult for two, Caucasian males like ourselves to talk about, but that it is also such a versatile topic that probably won't be able to do it full justice just in this limited reaction segment. It's something that we may explore more fully in the future.
Yeah, I think it would be good to maybe explore it again later down the road with maybe another guest. And it is just something that even if you ask economists, city planners, you ask two people, you're probably going to get two different answers on the pros and cons, the winners and losers in a redevelopment scenario of an underprivileged or underserved neighborhood. It certainly has, I think, a negative connotation, but hopefully we can really do it some justice and, as best we can.
Yeah. And I think this episode with Gill was an attempt to be more of a balance, because he considers himself at least a community builder and he tries to be more involved, but he's also still on the developer side. So the conversation still leans to one side of the gentrification discussion, but it is still, I think, maybe more balanced than what we've had.
Oh, absolutely. And of developers that I've talked to in the city, he definitely seems to take a much more cautious approach than I think some do. He seems to care about more than simply turning a good return on his investment. He seems to actually want to improve neighborhoods for everyone involved, and that's not necessarily something you see with other developers.
Well, see, that's part of the problem too, right? So we can just kind of dive right into maybe to our white paper for today. Mm-hmm. But there, especially in light of everything that's been happening lately, that there's been a lot more of a spotlight on Nulu's redevelopment and the gentrification that occurred there. And, one of the biggest issues was that there was an old public housing site called the Clarksdale that had over 700 units, and that was demolished and replaced with Liberty Green, and only 3.2% of those former residents returned. And so that is legit gentrification that occurred in Nulu. But I think you see a whole litany of developers that were a part of that sometimes you see the one developer's intentions may not match up with the others. And it's kind of a sum of its parts type of situation.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And the displacement, I think, is the biggest fear that people have. Probably, I would assume with gentrification, when people are talking about the negative side effects of it, and it is something to worry about. The paper one of the papers we looked at today, the City Lab article titled "The Hidden Winners in Neighborhood Gentrification," actually, and I know this is tough applying it to the Nulu example because it seemed higher than this, but in total of I think 100 major metropolitan cities that have experienced some form of gentrification that the paper analyzed, there was actually less outflows of former renters and former homeowners than you would have expected, or I think is often talked about when people are discussing gentrification. I think it was something like 10% of renters ended up moving from newly gentrifying areas of town, which actually is only slightly above the 6% of renters that move in non-gentrifying depressed neighborhoods. So it really is a 4 percentage point difference, which is bad and needs to be considered when talking about this, but I think it's substantially lower than most people would assume.
So this is where this article talks about displacement, and it's basically an analysis of a white paper, like a pure academic article.
Yeah.
But the one area where this article I think falls short is that it talks about that difference in displacement, but it doesn't narrow down exactly what percentage of those people being displaced is. So if you typically have 6% top to bottom moving out of a neighborhood, and then during gentrification, if you have 10%, but the 10% is all the bottom, that is an issue. But some of that is just very situational. You know, and so I think sometimes when you talk about gentrification in certain areas, you see it more maybe when you have more national investors coming in. If you have a landlord in the local area, you know, you have two options. They can raise rents or wait for their leases to expire so that they can raise the rents and get new tenants in there, or they can keep the rent the same and keep their tenants. And there's a lot of at least smaller investors, local investors, that see it as, you know, a bird in the hand is worth more than two in the bush. So they'd rather keep their tenant than take the risk and have downtime, because that's more of an investment for them. But if you have these big national corporations that are trying to invest in these cities, in these new up and coming areas, all they're going to try and do is make it as fancy and upscale as possible to get the maximum amount of profit that they possibly can.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, essentially what you're saying is basically if you already own property in that area and you have renters, why forego the known cash flow to upgrade and maybe fill it down the road? You don't know what kind of timeline it's going to be to fill it with people when you upgrade rents, when you upgrade the property and then increase rents. Yeah,
absolutely. And that was the other thing, though, this paper actually discussed, was that there are winners. The property owners are typically winners, right? You know, unless they get forced to displace because the property taxes go up so substantially they can no longer afford it. They're on a fixed income of some kind. But even then, basically the analysis was, it looked at a period in Philadelphia or across the country that said that essentially people that moved, that were displaced, typically didn't have worse outcomes. So people that were living in that neighborhood before the gentrification that moved to a different neighborhood, typically, one, they made a profit when they sold their home, but two, typically didn't end up in a worse situation.
Yeah, absolutely. Another aspect that I found incredibly interesting, and it should be obvious, but I think it would be very easily overlooked in a lot of articles or analysis of gentrification. Typical stats you see are rising average rents and rising median rents. And when those two things are going up, it doesn't necessarily mean that the people in the low rent category are experiencing that. Like the averages are going up because renovation is happening and the rents at the top are increasing, and median is going up for that same reason. And so simply looking at those two numbers, which I think are very often put forward as those are typically put forward as a negative example of what can go wrong when a neighborhood is experiencing gentrification. And they alone aren't going to really give you any input on what's happening to people at the lower end of the rent spectrum.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that's a good point as well, is that a lot of the statistics that get put forward don't necessarily always showcase the holistic picture. Yeah, and everything gets pulled, one for both sides. And this podcast is not meant to be like a justification of gentrification, but that you see these different snippets of stats that just don't show the whole picture by themselves.
That could so clearly make a headline, like average rents went up X amount, and that is that kind of eye-catching number that, again, when you think a little bit deeper, it's not as illustrative as, looking at the totality of the statistics that you could derive from a given neighborhood.
Yeah. I think what we also see here too is a little bit, and you see it in a strange connection, crossroads even, is that you see people that are anti-gentrification and trying to see more like public housing in a lot of newer developments or market rate housing in newer developments also converge with NIMBY people.
Yeah.
And so, for example, in one park, those two groups, the people that were in the Highlands that didn't want quote unquote an eyesore or something very big, which I would have been fine with the original, to be quite honest. And you had the people wanting to have more affordable housing in the project, both come together, but for different reasons. And so you see that aversion to development in a lot of areas, and it's just going to be simply impossible to please everybody. But at the same time, I don't know what the ask is. Like, I don't know what the pure solution to gentrification is, because if you don't have people bringing in revenue or bringing in money to help facilitate growth in areas that have become more run down, all that money then gets spent in the wealthier parts of town. And then you just have like these pristine areas and the discrepancy, the disparity, the accessibility to stores, restaurants, everything, jobs, just gets further and further exacerbated by not having that inflow of revenue. So I don't know the total answer. I still always go back to cooperatives. I think, for example, I think the Louisville Community Grocery is something that could really help uplift people and provide stakeholders an opportunity to change their neighborhood, provide something that the neighborhood needs, provide more wealth creation. But cooperatives by themselves are just not enough to fix to uplift a neighborhood without some sort of outsider money.
So you just said two things that stand out to me that I agree with implicitly. One, I think cooperatives are a great first step to trying to engage communities in depressed parts of town, to try and give them a greater stake in the business environment in their surrounding area. And
the city should have a fund to help them develop.
Yeah, absolutely. No, the city should do everything they can to try and develop and spur cooperative growth. And two, you're not going to please everybody.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
It really is just that simple. Either way you do it, whether the money flows into the community or it goes elsewhere, people are going to complain. Some people are going to complain regardless of what you do.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely fair. So to summarize quickly before we move on, I think it's really important to have the kind of key takeaways from our gentrification discussion that we've just had, which is each time there's a new development happening, it appears to be very situational, so that when they're talking about rents, especially because renters are the most impacted, rents seem to be the biggest variable. And then in order to positively impact some of these community developments, you have to have a lot of localization, people from the area that are invested in making the community stronger. And then you have to have community involvement. Those seem to be overlapping, but they're not. The localization is more about investment. The community involvement is saying people in those neighborhoods, in those areas, what do they need? How can you better their lives? What amenities would make their lives better without forcing them out? So to me, those are the big takeaways, and incredibly important to keep in mind anytime new regions start to get looked at for development and revitalization. I don't want to beat this conversation too much into the ground unless you have anything else you want to add to it.
That's it for me.
So is there anything else because we obviously talked more than just about gentrification with Gill Holland. So what else stood out to you in that interview?
I've got to say, I've only seen, I think, 2 films that Gill has produced. I love An Honest Liar. It's one of my favorite films that I don't think enough people have seen. But I was surprised to hear the success he had at Sundance. And it's an incredible thing. I'm sure that was a heck of a time. God, I couldn't imagine. But no, and it was fun hearing him talk about how much he clearly cares about about the communities that he tries to work in. Like having somebody working with a historian to get a book written about the Portland neighborhood, like that's an amazing and almost crazy thing that like no other developer in the city is doing. I can guarantee you that.
Well, and that was actually something that we talked about off the air with him, was that, you know, I went down to church at what was Our Lady, which is now Good Shepherd, in Portland for the first 10 and a half years of my life. And he could even fill me in on background that I thought I knew that I didn't really actually ever know about the flood wall and everything. Just having that level of knowledge and trying to be able to keep those pieces together when working on building a community is I think absolutely important.
No, definitely.
And the other part that I thought that he touched on that was great was the environmental consciousness that I don't think a lot of developers really care too much in the city. I mean, for the sheer fact that he was the only one or the Green Building is the only one that has a LEED approved commercial building.
Yeah. Platinum certification.
Yeah.
But no, and honestly, it's interesting as well as disheartening to hear that it's one of the only way. He thinks it's still maybe the only one in Kentucky, not even just Louisville. Like I guess it shouldn't be that surprising in the heart of coal country, but man, it does kind of piss me off.
Yeah. Yeah. It's just something that needs to be considered. I mean, this goes back to our conversation with Cindy Sullivan and Trees Louisville, was that solar and green trees, the canopy, they are a little bit combative.
Yeah.
But if you're creative with it, like I think what he talked about with the Green Building, literally having grass, a green roof, and solar panels. I mean, that you just have to find the areas you can to sneak in tree canopy, to sneak in renewable energy, solar panels, wherever you can to make these commercial places more sustainable. And honestly, that's going to help those neighborhoods more substantially, just because everything's going to be more walkable, everything's going to be more breathable, everything will, you would assume the utility costs would be lower in the neighborhood too. The more buildings that have solar panels, the lower the utility rates will be. So there's just a whole lot that has to go into consideration in developing cities. And it's just fascinating to me.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the last thing I would say, unless you have anything else, is that he also brought up streetscapes, and his final aside was he'd love to close a massive swath of downtown and make it walking only, ban cars, walking, biking, maybe public transportation only, or even ultimately light rail. Did he mention that?
Oh, he certainly did. And I know that's something that's right up your alley.
Yeah, that's a pipe dream of mine too. Yeah. So, because I think accessibility is absolutely important to inequity or solving the inequity in our city, or at least a part of that puzzle. And so I was glad to hear that. And as a little sneak peek, our next episode is literally going to be with how to make cities more bikeable and accessible through transportation.
I was going to say the transportation discussion, we're going to hit that hard
in the next episode. Yeah. So I think if you're interested in that topic, stay tuned. But this was a great introduction into the kind of developer side of community building.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for tuning in, guys.
Appreciate it.
As always, thanks for tuning in. Thanks for joining us on Building This Community. If you'd like any more information, you can follow us on Twitter at BuildingThisCom, COM, or you can follow Andrew
at Andrew J. Klump. And you can also follow Luke
at LMP43. Definitely subscribe, and we look forward to talking to you guys next week.